It's interesting that Lewis said that he felt at one particular point in his life he had to write a fairy tale or he would burst. And The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, I think, in a way, really did burst out of him in an almost fully formed way. There's very little calculation about it. It just sort of emerged ready-made almost, or fell from heaven into his lap. It was the book he was born to write.
Hello and welcome to And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Levitt, and I am thrilled and excited about this really important and fun podcast today that we're going to be doing. Today we're going to be celebrating C.S. Lewis's amazing and seminal work, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, much loved by children and adults alike. And this month, October of 2020, is the 70th anniversary of its initial publication. Thrilled to talk about this book, Professor Michael Ward, who is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall, University of Oxford, and professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. He is the author of the award-winning Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, and the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis. He is also was able, on the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, he unveiled a permanent national memorial to him at Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey, and is the co-editor of the volume of commemorative essays marking the anniversary entitled C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner. He was the resident warden of the Kilns, which is Lewis's Oxford home, from 1996 to 1999. He studied English at Oxford, theology at Cambridge, and has a PhD in divinity from St. Andrews. And of course, the reason we have him on, and his chief claim to fame, is that he handed a pair of X-ray spectacles to James Bond in the movie The World Is Not Enough. And I know you probably can't say anything about it in case you have future consideration, but I think you got robbed. I think you should have gotten the Academy Award for Best Supporting Extra. And, hopefully in the future, they'll consider you for that. Yeah. But I want to thank Professor Michael Ward to And If Love Remains.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be with you, Mike.
It's my pleasure. And especially at this time, it really is a wonderful time to talk about this book. And we all, anybody who loves C.S. Lewis seems to have kind of a C.S. Lewis origin story. I came to C.S. Lewis a little bit later in life. My wife loved his books, and my son was a reader quite early in his life, and read his stories very young, and seemed to notice some of the Christian symbolism early on that I hadn't noticed. And so, I came to him late, but I've learned to just adore and love and just think what an amazing man he was. But what is your origin story? How did you come to C.S. Lewis and come to his work?
Very early, my parents read the Narnia books to me and my two brothers when we were growing up. And some of my earliest memories actually consist of Sunday mornings before breakfast even. We would pile into our parents' bed, and my mum would read a chapter or two of the latest Chronicle, and then we'd all get up and have breakfast and go off to church. And I remember that vividly, not least because I was always squidged between my parents, and my two other brothers they got edge seats, as it were.
Right.
And that was lovely. And my parents told me just enough about the second level of meaning, the Christian parallels, to pique my interest. And I found that to be a cool thing, that there was a Christian element to these stories, because most other stories I was reading, just had one level of meaning. So that's how I was first exposed to C.S. Lewis. And as soon as I was old enough to read the Narnia books for myself, I did so. And then I went on to his other fiction and his Christian apologetics, and then into his academic writings. And I did an English degree at Oxford, and so I began, for the first time to study him and write about him a bit more seriously and academically.
And what caused that? Like, why did you decide to really that was going to be, in a way, your life's work to study C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, I didn't know it would be my life's work when I was just an undergraduate. I was just pursuing a keen interest of mine. And, because I liked his works and found them very interesting, and, because they appeal to my twin interests, which have always been literature and theology, he was, the natural person for me to turn to when it came time for me to do my PhD. Um, so it was never a sort of calculated decision that, oh, I'm going to become a C.S. Lewis scholar. It was more, I'm a C.S. Lewis reader and enthusiast, and I will just follow my own, hedonistic impulses, as it were. Do what pleases me, and actually, I think that's not a bad strategy for would-be academics to follow whatever that you most like, because what you like, what you love, what you're most interested in is probably what you'll study best, um,
Right.
and certainly proved the case for me. At any rate, um, I've um, I've not yet tired of him, and I'm hoping still to, for many years yet, to keep writing and studying and speaking about him.
He seems definitely to be a deep well that doesn't have a bottom. And when you read about him and you read his you read his stories, you never get sick of him because there's just more there.
That's right. I mean, he was just a huge man with a very diverse output. Um, there are huge men who have a narrow output, and so they might be just as important figures, but they're less interesting because they wrote on, in only one area. Whereas Lewis, he's got his fiction, both children's and adult fiction. He's got his Christian apologetics. He's got his academic writings on English literature. So three major departments, and I haven't even mentioned his poetry, which is quite significant actually. And then, in addition to all his writings, he had a very interesting life. Teaching at Oxford, an adult conversion, interacting with other famous people like Tolkien, and then having a most remarkable late marriage to Joy Davidman, which was itself the subject of a feature film. So, everywhere you look, Lewis is just a fascinating, intriguing, and as you say, yeah, bottomlessly interesting man.
It's fun. I mean, would it be fair to say that maybe next to Shakespeare, he might be arguably the most important literary figure um, in in the English speaking world?
Well, it all depends how you measure these things, and it may be a bit too early to put Lewis on a par with Shakespeare, who's had several centuries to acquire his reputation.
True, true.
But yeah, I mean, I sometimes find myself thinking of Shakespeare in comparison to Lewis, just because of the breadth of vision. When you read Shakespeare, you've got everything from silly romantic comedies through English histories to late romances and great tragedies, not to mention again Shakespeare's own poetry. So there's the same kind of vast canvas, a very colourful, diverse canvas in Shakespeare as there is in Lewis's writings. But of course, we know a lot more about Lewis's life than we know about Shakespeare's. So Lewis has, at least in one respect, something of an advantage over the bard there.
Right, right. Well, and one of the reasons I'm thrilled to have you on is um, because of the important book that you wrote, Planet Narnia, and the work that you did and are continuing to do. And I want you to go into that a little bit about the discovery you made, because I really do believe this might be one of the most important um, literary discoveries that we have of anybody, at least in 20th century writing, for sure. And it's quite a remarkable story. So, will you please give us a summary of how you came to this discovery and and what it's all about.
Yeah, well, this is a discovery I made in 2001, I think it was, quite a long time ago now. And it's all to do with the Narnia Chronicles and what the overarching or undergirding imaginative structure to the Chronicles is. I've already mentioned that they have two obvious levels of meaning. They've got the superficial story level, which a young child can enjoy. They've got the biblical parallels, which can be appreciated if you have scriptural knowledge. Um, but quite a lot of Lewis scholars and critics have said there must be a third level of meaning because the books don't seem to hang together as consistently and coherently as you would expect from a man like C.S. Lewis.
Right.
As Lewis was a very rigorous and consistent thinker, and he didn't do things randomly or chaotically. But when you consider the Narnia Chronicles from one point of view, they do seem to be a bit random. All sorts of odd things crop up in different chronicles. Why is Father Christmas in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, for instance? He doesn't obviously belong there. And some of Lewis's friends actually advised Lewis to leave Father Christmas out of that first story because, the Narnians they show a knowledge of Father Christmas, but the Narnians show no knowledge of a festival called Christmas, let alone of a character called Christ.
Huh.
So,
Right.
what would they mean by Father Christmas in Narnia? It doesn't obviously make sense. It doesn't seem to logically cohere. And then you've got other oddities in later books, like the appearance of Bacchus in Prince Caspian, and various other peculiarities in later books. But I suppose we ought to stick to the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Anyway, there are lots of reasons to think that there ought to be a third level of significance in these books. And different scholars and critics have suggested all sorts of different theories. They've suggested that maybe Lewis was working to the seven deadly sins, or the
Right.
seven classical virtues, or the seven books of Spenser's Fairy Queen, which was one of his favourite poems. And all sorts of different sevens have been suggested as his pattern, as his scheme. But rather remarkably, no one had considered the seven heavens, the seven planets of the medieval cosmos. And that is remarkable because the seven heavens are all over Lewis's work. They are present in his Ransom trilogy, the three books of interplanetary adventure that he wrote.
Yes.
They are present in a very long, complex poem he wrote in the 1930s called The Planets. They are present in, academic discussions in The Discarded Image and elsewhere.
And this was part of his academic knowledge. I mean, this is part of the corpus that he was, putting out into the world, what had to do with medieval writing and this is it's not like it would be unfamiliar to him.
No, not at all. I mean, he was a medieval scholar. That was his area of special expertise as an academic. So he knew, about the old pre-Copernican, the geocentric model of the cosmos, and wrote about it extensively, as I say, and in all different departments of his output: academic, poetic, and fiction. But interestingly, nobody had ever asked themselves, is it possible that the seven Narnia books are keyed to the seven heavens? And this was a kind of bolt from the blue that hit me between the eyeballs one night back in 2003 or whenever it was. I think I said 2001 earlier, but it was 2003.
Okay.
Or anyway, sometime like that. I ought to know this, oughtn't I? But can't remember precisely. I know
That's okay. The important thing is that it happened.
it was a Wednesday night in February, and I was lying in bed and I was reading his long poem about the planets, and I got to the lines about Jupiter. And I read in this poem that Jupiter, one of Jupiter's influences, according to medieval thought, as represented by Lewis in this poem, one of his influences was to bring about winter past and guilt forgiven. And those 5 words leapt off the page at me, winter past and guilt forgiven, because they seemed to me like a 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Right.
All about the passing of winter, the White Witch's winter, and the forgiving of Edmund's guilt. Edmund, who has betrayed his brother and sisters and gone over to the White Witch's side. So I looked more closely at these lines about Jupiter and the jovial influences, and so many of the lines in the poem link up with images and themes in the book. And then my mind slowly cranking, I thought, well, there are another 6 planets and there are another 6 chronicles. Perhaps they all match up. And it was pretty easy to see that they did. And
Wow.
I was stunned. I was almost literally concussed. I felt like I'd fallen down and knocked my head because I'd been reading these books for, well, about 30 years, nearly 30 years by that point, and I felt I knew them already very well. And here was a whole new dimension of complexity and intricacy revealing itself to me, and it was just stunning. And so I've spent the last 17 years or however long it is, you know, writing about this, speaking about it, even making a BBC documentary about it called the Narnia Code. And I'm pleased to say that nearly everybody who's looked at my findings at all seriously says, "Yeah, of course, this explains the other way puzzling
It's
oddity."
the key that unlocks that door, that wardrobe door, if you will.
Yes, yes, yes.
And
And it's a beautiful and very intriguing thing that he did, and there are all sorts of reasons why he would have done it, which I go into in depth in my book Planet Narnia. And there's a much shorter version of that book called the Narnia Code for people who don't want all the detail and footnotes. Um, and yeah, maybe we can talk about some of those
yeah,
reasons.
as you tell this story, it strikes me because I do know that you did study theology. I have to wonder if you feel like you were put in you were prepared for this moment for even Lewis to look down on the earth and say, okay, I'm ready for this secret to be revealed. Here it is. And Michael Ward is the one to do it.
Yeah,
Do you feel that way a little bit?
well, a little bit. It felt a bit providential, yes. And in fact, in the final chapter of Planet Narnia, I write about the circumstances of this discovery in a bit more detail, because there was something that happened earlier that very day, which I think set me up, as it were, spiritually to perceive what was going on here. So it did feel to me a bit of a godsend, a bit of a gift, um, and yeah, so it was a great, as it were, privilege to stumble across this when other people had been looking for this key or
Right.
scheme, but for some reason it had passed them by, and it fell to me to realize it.
Do
But
you do
the
you
important thing is not, the important thing is not at all that it was I who discovered it.
right.
The important thing,
Other than it
yeah.
had to be you because you were prepared. I mean, you had studied. I mean, you were the man for the job.
Well, as it turned out to be the case, yeah. But I couldn't have got there without help from a lot of other people, of
Of
course.
course.
Yeah.
Uh, a question though on that. Oh, and I just lost my train of thought. I apologize, but I think of specifically it being this hodgepodge of books, and I guess that brings me to a question about the books themselves, and specifically the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because did he write that when he wrote that book? Was that meant to be a one-off? Or I mean, it seems as if it couldn't have been if he had this kind of master plan in mind as he wrote. What's your thinking on the series? The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, as it pertains to the series. Was it this one-off children's story, or did he have this in mind from the beginning?
Well, my argument in Planet Nine is that when Lewis started writing the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he had in mind that he would key it to the symbolism of Jupiter, that he would infuse it with these jovial images. Um, I've got no way of knowing whether at that point Lewis had all 7 books laid out secretly in mind. He certainly doesn't say that he did, and indeed he indicates the opposite. He says that he only had 1 book in his mind to begin with. But that's no objection to my case, because if that is indeed true, then it just grew incrementally. Each book, as it came to him, was keyed to another planet, and he stopped after 7. And it's worth bearing in mind that he had written 4 of the books before the first was even published. So he, once he knew there was going to be a series, he was able, if he needed to go back and make adjustments to the the earlier book, so that they would cohere as a series and not as
Right.
7 disconnected units. So yeah, I mean, some people seem to get very hung up about this issue, and they say, oh well, if Lewis didn't have all 7 books in mind to begin with, then it can't be true. But that doesn't follow at all. It just grew 1 book at a time, and then it seems after he'd written 3 or perhaps 4, at that point he evidently decided he was going to do 7.
Right.
But it doesn't really matter.
And I mean, there's there. Here's another question that I have. Do you suspect that the reason why this key wasn't found is because kind of our cultural modern sympathies, that the fact that we live in such a literal world, we see, when we think of the solar system, we think of what we learned in school, and there's 9 planets, and it's built in such a way that we like it's almost a veil was over our eyes. We couldn't even see what C.S. Lewis was trying to do with these medieval cosmology. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, that's no doubt part of it, that we are just unfamiliar with this old symbolic system. And yeah, we tend to think that old cosmological arrangement, having been superseded by the heliocentric cosmos and Newton and then Einstein and so on, that it's just passé, and it's of no importance, and it's of no interest to us or to anyone. So that is indeed, I'm sure, a factor, but a more sort of pertinent factor for those who know their C.S. Lewis is that most of the students and scholars on C.S. Lewis have been Christians, as indeed I am, but a lot of Christians assume that anything which even comes close to astrology must, by definition, be unchristian, and therefore they think Lewis cannot have been interested in it. But that's based on a misapprehension, because actually there was a long tradition of Christian astrology. And we shouldn't think of astrology as necessarily a bad or a dangerous thing, because astrology only means the study of the stars. You have biology, the study of life. You have geology, the study of the earth. You have anthropology, the study of humankind. You have astrology, the study of the stars. So nothing necessarily wrong about studying an aspect of God's creation. It all depends what you do with that astrology. If it leads you to worship the stars, or if it leads you to regard their supposed influences as determinative and controlling you and overruling your free will and your responsibility before God, then yeah, that would be wrong astrology. That would be bad. But what if it was good astrology? What if it was like what we see in Matthew's gospel, when the 3 wise men come from the east,
Right.
Following a star? We have seen his star in the east, and we have come to worship him, the wise men say. Sorry, and there may not have been 3 of them, but there were 3 gifts. That's why we think there were 3 of them.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, that's only one example of good astrology, of finding spiritual significance in an aspect of God's creation, which leads you to greater devotion to Christ. And it's that kind of Christian tradition of astrology which Lewis and so many of the people that he's basing his ideas on practiced or believed in, or at any rate used poetically. Because I don't think Lewis himself subscribe to anything like um, the medieval understanding in a literal sense, but he
Right.
regarded it as a useful symbolic system. Indeed, he says in 1935 that the seven heavens, as conceived by medieval astrology, seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. So he makes it very clear that he's got a definite keen interest and a high estimation of the value of these seven heavens.
Yes, absolutely. So let's point a little bit to the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you mentioned Father Christmas. How and your discovery really hinged on this planet's poem, specifically the part about Jupiter and how that pointed to the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. How is Jupiter the um fill the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe universe? How does that infuse itself into it?
Yeah, well, the main thing to get clear in your mind when you're thinking about Jupiter is that Jupiter is the king, symbolically speaking. And Lewis makes this totally clear in his book, The Discarded Image. But he says we must have a particular kind of king in mind. We must think of a king at peace, enthroned, taking his leisure, serene, tranquil, magnanimous. When Jupiter dominates, we will have prosperity and halcyon days. It's these kinds of kingly, regal, monarchical qualities which are associated with Jove, to give him his other name. So, it's very interesting that when Aslan is first mentioned to the children, they don't know who he is. They've never met him before. And they say, "Is he a man?" And the beavers say, "Aslan a man? Of course not. He's the king." That's the very first description given of Aslan. He is the king.
The king.
And we're later told he's the king of the wood, he's the king of the beasts, he's got a crown and a standard and a royal pavilion and all these royal accoutrements about him. He's got a great royal head. He's the son of the emperor. All these monarchical terms and images cluster around Aslan himself. So that's one way in which Jupiter is, as it were, manifesting his influence. Or rather, this is one way in which Lewis is depicting his Christ character by means of Jupiter symbolism.
Right.
That'd be the better way to put it. Um, and then when you turn from Aslan to the children, well, remember what happens when they first all get into the wardrobe together. They find that it's cold and snowy inside, and they put on the fur coats. And we're told that these fur coats looked more like royal robes than coats when they put them on. So
That's
there,
right.
right at the start of the children's adventures in Narnia, we're getting an indication that they themselves will become royal because they're dressing up, appropriately for that status. And that's indeed where the story finishes at the end in the great
Well,
coronation.
everybody seems to be anticipating them as well.
Exactly. Yes, there's this great prophecy about the four thrones at Cair Paravel. The Narnians have been waiting for these children to turn up to be the kings and queens, and we're told repeatedly: once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. Once a queen in Narnia, always a queen in Narnia. So, the important thing from a Christian point of view is that Lewis is using this symbolism implicitly, quietly, secretly. He's not making it overt, but he's using it to indicate how when you follow Christ, you become Christ like. So when the children follow Aslan, the king, they themselves become royal. It's a beautifully simple but sophisticated theological spiritual truth that Lewis is communicating, but he's doing it at a subliminal level. It's not something which he asks us to consciously recognize, but it's something which he just expects us to intuit or to feel. He just throws us into this jovial world so that we will recognize the harmonies that are present between the Christ character and his followers, which is how, obviously, in his own Christian belief, he thought people should live and behave in the real world.
Right. Is that is that why I remember a story? Maybe it's apocryphal. I don't know, but I remember a story of him saying something to the effect that he was shocked how popular The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was, because he realized that if he could, in a way, rewrite the Christian story, that that it would sell, that it would become a way to infuse Christianity by using these stories. Is that a true story that he said, or a true
Well,
statement?
it's true, but about a different book. Um,
Oh, okay.
With actually, I think what you're mentioning there is with reference to his first Ransom trilogy book, Out of the
That's
Silent Planet, where he
that's
says,
right.
yeah, any amount of Christian theology can be smuggled into people's imaginations under cover of romance without them being aware of it. And so, yeah, he learnt that that was a good strategy in his trilogy, and yeah, he deployed it, but even more cunningly, even more cannily in the Narnia books.
Right, right. And and part of that, well, another aspect of that jovial spirit, the spirit of Jupiter, is the idea of, and you mentioned it before, guilt forgiven. How do we see that, and why is that a Jupiter character trait?
Yes, well, this is something that, as I say, he mentions in his Planets poem, where he talks about winter past and guilt forgiven. And I think he got that particular aspect of Jupiter, not probably so much from his medieval sources, as at least I've not been able to trace a particular tradition of medieval thought on that forgiveness aspect, but more from his fellow Inkling, Charles Williams, who was one of his closest friends, um, because Charles Williams, in one of his works, um, writes about how Jupiter is a red pierced planet. And if you know your astronomy, you know that Jupiter does indeed have a big red spot on it, the great red
Right.
eye of Jupiter. And Charles Williams, in one of his poems, focuses in on this red eye, the red pierced planet. And then C.S. Lewis, writing about Williams's poem, I'll just quote you a sentence. Charles Williams assumes, this is C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams assumes that the huge reddish spot which astronomers observe on the surface of Jupiter is a wound, and the redness is that of blood. Jupiter, the planet of kingship, thus wounded, becomes another ectype, that is to say, another reflection, another symbol of the divine king wounded on Calvary. So that shows us that, in Lewis's own circle of friends, there was this idea of Jupiter having a particular symbolic connection with Christ on the cross, the divine king wounded on Calvary because of
Right.
the red spot. Think of the bleeding side of Christ when we see images of the crucifixion. That's what Jupiter signifies. And so when Aslan is put to death for the sake of the traitor Edmund, that's the Jupiter influence being exerted in a very palpable and precious fashion.
That's powerful, and that is such a um I know when he writes that part of the book, I mean, he slows down his prose, and it's very, like, it's one of the most moving scenes in and memorable scenes in all of the Chronicles of Narnia,
Mm,
um is Aslan sacrificing himself to reach that deeper magic
mm,
in order to to have that guilt forgiven.
mm. Yeah, so we've talked about kingship, we've talked about guilt forgiven, and the other major aspect of the jovial influence is winter past,
Hmm.
because Jupiter is associated with springtime, or with May time especially, And that is very present in the medieval sources that Lewis is drawing upon. So remember how, at the start of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we're told that the White Witch has put the land of Narnia under a 100-year curse. And it's important to remember that this winter is an accursed winter. A lot of people, I think, rather get that wrong, and they think of Lucy going through the wardrobe into this romantic winter wonderland with snowflakes falling beautifully
Thank you, Hollywood.
on her eyelashes, and it's not that kind of winter. It's a dark and forbidding winter, and even some of the trees are on the witch's side.
Right.
The only beautiful bit about this winter is the description of the beavers' dam, and it's that's testimony to the beavers themselves and their own faithfulness that they've managed to make something beautiful even out of this accursed state. But otherwise, it's a forbidding and doom-laden winter which needs to be got rid of. Which is why Tumnus laments the lost days of jollification, and he longs for Christmas. It's always winter, but never Christmas. It's a permanently petrified state. You don't even get the good thing of winter. You get only the bad. But of course, as Aslan comes, when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And so the spring defeats the winter. And, to put it in planetary terms, Jupiter defeats Saturn, because Saturn, in Lewis's imagination, was always associated with winter and coldness and darkness and death.
Wow. And of course that's where we have Father Christmas arrive. We have him come to start the celebration, of the end of winter.
That's right, and it's worth bearing in mind that just from the point of view of the calendar, that Christmas Day follows quickly upon the shortest day of winter. The 21st of December, the winter solstice or whatever it's called. And yeah, so as soon as Father Christmas comes, we know which way things are heading. It's going to get better. And soon the country turns from January to May, we're told. And
and what does he do? He gives the children gifts, and and these gifts are important, and also part of their, going back to the first theme, it's part of their kingly powers in a way. It's what signifies them, I think.
Yes, it's part of their royal status that they get these gifts. So yeah, winter passes, guilt is forgiven, and all of this happens under the true king. Long live the true king, Father Christmas says when he sleds off, having given children the gifts.
Yes, that's so how we've talked about, these themes and these ideas. And I know Lewis insisted that Narnia was not an allegory. And although we at least those of us who see it from a Christian perspective, maybe treat it as if it is. How is it not an allegory?
Yeah, this is Lewis being rather pedantic, if you like. He had a very narrow definition of allegory in this regard. He said an allegory is when you take something immaterial or abstract, like the feeling of doubt, and you give it a concrete embodiment. Likewise with despair. Despair is a feeling or an emotion, a sentiment. It's not a concrete reality. But if you're writing an allegory, you can give both doubt and despair concrete forms, which is what John Bunyan does famously in The Pilgrim's Progress, probably the greatest allegory in the English language. John Bunyan gives us giant despair, who locks people up in Doubting Castle.
Right.
So their doubt and despair are given the forms of a castle and a giant, and that's what Lewis means by allegory. An abstract thing in terms of a concrete reality. Whereas in Narnia, he says it's not allegorical because Jesus is not an abstract or immaterial reality. Jesus is indeed the most concrete reality there is. So to give him the form of a lion, to make him, represented as Aslan, is not strictly speaking allegorical in this according to this particular definition. But if you use a slightly looser definition of allegory as one thing in terms of another, then we can fairly describe Narnia as allegorical. Jesus is depicted in terms of a lion. And, I think that's a fair use of the word allegory myself, but Lewis preferred to use the term supposition. Let us suppose that Jesus became incarnate in a world like Narnia. What form might he have taken? Let us suppose it was a lion. And that's suppositional writing, not allegorical writing, as far as he's concerned.
Okay, that makes sense. That's interesting. I want to ask you. Well, let me start this way. Like I said, I came to this book a little bit later in life, and I one of the scenes that really touched me is actually after the Aslan resurrection, when he summons Edmund into to him, and Edmund gives his confession, and I think it's because it's something I can relate to. He emerges and he's addressing the Narnians, and he says something to the effect of, Edmund has confessed. We've talked about it. Let's not mention it again.
Mm.
And to me, that was so moving because, I know I've done things that if I'd love to get off my chest and know that God has forgiven and forgotten and that whole idea. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what is one or what is one of your very favorite scenes from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and why is that?
Mm. Yeah, well, I too like that moment when Edmund is restored to his brother and sisters. It's done very simply but profoundly.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the clever things about it is that Lewis doesn't take us into the conversation between Aslan and Edmund.
Right.
We just see them at a distance walking together in the dewy grass, apart from the rest of everybody. And there's no need to tell you, and no one ever heard what Aslan was saying, but it was a conversation which Edmund never forgot. So that's a very subtle way of reminding the reader that, we only have one soul to really be concerned about, and that's our own. And how we relate to God is the important thing. And we shouldn't get too fixated upon what is happening between other people and God. That's their business.
Yes.
So, mind your own business, I think is one of Lewis's principles in the spiritual life. So yeah, that's a great moment. But probably my own favorite is a bit later in the story when it's in the final chapter, actually, when I'll just read you the bit of it. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for them all, I don't know, but somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down on the grass to a fine high tea at about 8 o'clock. Next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river, and the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them. Before them were the sands, with rocks and little pools of salt water and seaweed, and the smell of the sea, and long miles of bluish-green waves breaking for ever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls! Have you heard it? Can you remember? And that's just a fantastic moment, if you
Yes.
ask me, because it's a very odd moment in one way, in the way that Lewis directly addresses the reader and says, "Have you heard seagulls, and can you remember them?" If you've heard seagulls, of course you can remember them. Why shouldn't you be able to remember them?
Right.
It's an odd question, but the point of the question, I think, is really to, as it were, dislodge the reader from the prison of the present moment, and to get them to cast their mind back to some happy summer holiday they had by the sea, perhaps as a child, perhaps, some lovely summer holiday with their family, and one's first glimpse of the sea is often a very momentous occasion for people. Um, there's a sense of freedom and freshness and expanse, and um, so by casting your mind back to that happy day in your past, you are, as it were, making a kind of imaginative move similar to the forgiving of guilt. You're getting back to an innocent moment in your past.
Right.
You're undoing, the the shackles of time and sin and sadness and old age, or however old you may be. You were once younger, and the idea of getting back to youth, getting back to an untroubled past, a paradisal past, effectively getting back to Eden. That's all, symbolically similar to redemption, to forgiveness.
Yes.
But it's
Well,
done so indirectly and so discreetly.
right.
You hardly understand what's happening to you, but it goes straight to the heart if you read it in the right way.
Oh, yes, it's very much like um, how we become a new creature, how we can return to that innocence, as you said. It's
Mm.
that's quite beautiful.
Mm. It is. I love that moment in particular.
Wow.
I mean, Lewis had a great interest in what he called joy, this unsatisfied desire or longing, this inconsolable pang for unity with beauty and ultimately with the divine, with God Himself. And he writes all about that in Surprised by Joy, his autobiography. Um, and very often in his fiction, he's wanting to encapsulate a moment of joy, that kind of pang of yearning or longing. And I think that this moment in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is probably the best example of him doing that anywhere in his writings. And I think that's partly why The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is, I mean, there are many reasons, but this is one of the reasons why The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is his most famous and most successful book, because he just does it so simply, so purely, so effectively, so memorably, and everybody can relate to it.
Well,
Um,
he's and I almost don't like using this word because it doesn't quite say it, but he's so efficient in his prose that it does
mm,
just like pierce our soul.
yeah,
It says exactly what it needs to say, and
and no
it says
more.
it to me like it
Yeah,
says it to you.
that's right. You're right. The word efficient is a very good adjective to use, actually, because The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a very light book. It's not very long in comparison to the others. The longest, I think, is The Silver Chair, or maybe The Dawn Treader. But The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe has a very light, economical feel to it. It's perfectly balanced, perfectly sprung, like a fencer on his toes or something, or like
Right.
a gymnast in perfect trim. It's interesting that Lewis said that he felt at one particular point in his life he had to write a fairy tale or he would burst. And The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I think, in a way, really did burst out of him in an almost fully formed way. There's very little calculation about it. It just sort of emerged ready made almost, or fell from heaven into his lap. It was the book he was born to write, I think.
Yeah.
Whereas the later Narnia books, brilliant though they are obviously a bit more calculated. There's a bit more planning going on. And
Right.
that again helps to explain why The Lion is Lewis's masterpiece.
Yeah, absolutely. And why it will be, loved for generations to
Mm,
come as it has been. I think if there's one book that will be remembered, that C.S. Lewis wrote, it will be The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
mm. Yeah, I agree. Of all his books, that is, well, it's certainly the best known of the seven Narnia books. But it's even better known than, say, the Screw Tape Letters, which is
Hmm.
probably his most successful other work of fiction, at least his
Right.
best known other work of fiction. And fiction, of course, tends to last longer than non-fiction. However great Lewis's non-fiction is, and it is, marvelous. Works like Mere Christianity and The Four Loves and so on, they're not going to last as long.
Yes, I know. I think that's true. I think, yeah, fiction. Well, I mean, think about the old stories that we have, from medieval and from the, even from the classic period. Those are, they're parched as histories many times, but they're stories. They're stories that have, um, archetypal meaning, and the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I think, belongs in that same corpus.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, again, this is Mike Levitt. I'm with And If Love Remains, and I'm talking to Professor Michael Ward, the author of Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens and the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. One of the great books. If you're a C.S. Lewis fan, I mean, you have to purchase and read this book. It's absolutely a necessity for if you want to see how, the third level of depth that he brings to, that C.S. Lewis brings to the Narnia series. It's you will be reading them with, dim glasses until you read this book and understand this cosmological idea that he brings to the stories. Um, a quick question, for you: what are you working on these days? What should we be looking forward from Professor Ward? What are you going to be doing next?
I've just finished writing a guide to the abolition of man, which is Lewis's most philosophical work, um, which is really a defense of objective value. And it's quite a difficult, dense work, even though it's brief. And lots of university people study it and teach it, and it needs a guide, I think, because there's a lot going on. And so I've written this guide and commentary, which will be coming out in March, and it's going to be called Men Without Chests, which is the title of the first chapter of The Abolition of Man. So, Men Without Chests, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, will be published in March, all being well. That's my next big project, and hopefully I may come back on this podcast and talk about it with you then.
Oh, I would love it. I appreciate that. Would be fabulous.
Thank you.
One last question for you before we finish up. You participated, and I think were one of the main, um, organizers for having him, having a memorial play for him at, Westminster Abbey in Poets Corner. Can you speak to that a little bit and what that meant to you, and why that was important?
Yes, I was asked to spearhead that whole project. Actually, the Abbey has an educational institute. They put on lectures and day conferences and things. And one of the canons of the Abbey uh, asked me for ideas about what they might put on for such an educational program. And while I was speaking with that particular cleric, I said to him, well, if you're going to be doing that for the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, isn't it time that you also memorialized him in Poets' Corner? And he said, "Oh yeah, what a good idea. I think we'll do that." So it fell to me to, raise the money and and get and take soundings on the inscription that would go on the stone tablet, and then I thought someone important would do the unveiling. I thought they might even get a minor member of the royal family to do it. But when I said to the Abbey, why don't we get the Duchess of Cambridge to do it? They say, oh no, she's unavailable. She's pregnant. We can't get her. Um, and you do it? They said to me, you do it. It's no great shakes. You just pull off a piece of cloth and there it is. So it fell to me to unveil the thing as well,
Wow.
which was a great privilege. One of the most marvelous opportunities I've had in my life. So yeah, that was unveiled on precisely the 50th anniversary of his death back in 2013. And if your listeners don't know, Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey is the place where all great English literary figures are memorialised. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, everyone. Some of them are actually buried there, but most are just memorialized there. And so, if ever you go to Westminster Abbey, do look for this memorial. It's got Lewis's name and his dates, and the inscription is the quotation from his essay, Is Theology Poetry? The final line thereof, which goes, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else.
That's beautiful, and and I think we could say some similar things about the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Why it touches us is because it points to that light, that lets us see more clearly. I'm just thrilled, and I'm grateful for Professor Ward to be on, and I look forward to talking to you again, hopefully in March.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks for having me, Mike.
My pleasure. We'll catch you on the flip side. See you next time.